The Thin Man by Dashiell Hammett, Chapter 13. Dorothy and Quinn were at the bar when I went into the Palma Club. They did not see me until I came up beside Dorothy and said, "Hello, folks." Dorothy had on the same clothes I had last seen her in. She looked at me and at Quinn and her face flushed. "You had to tell him." "The girl's in a pit," Quinn said cheerfully. "I got that stock for you. You ought to pick up some more. And what are you drinking?" "Old-fashioned. You're a swell guest, ducking out without leaving a word behind you." Dorothy looked at me again. The scratches on her face were pale, the bruise barely showed, and her mouth was no longer swollen. "I trusted you," she said. She seemed about to cry. "What do you mean by that?" "You know what I mean. Even when you went to dinner at Mama's, I trusted you." "And why not?" Quinn said, "She's been in a pet all afternoon. Don't bait her." He put a hand on one of hers. There, darling, don't you—" "Please, shut up." She took her hand away from him. "You know very well what I mean," she told me. "You and Nora both made fun of me to Mama, and—" I began to see what had happened. "She told you that and you believed it?" I laughed. "After 20 years and you're still a sucker for her lies. I suppose she phoned you after we left. We had a row and didn't stay long." She hung her head and said, "Oh, I am a fool," in a low, miserable voice. Then she grabbed me by both arms and said, "Listen, let's go over and see Nora now. I've got to square myself with her. I'm such an ass. It'd serve me right if she never—" "Sure, there's plenty of time. Let's have this drink first." Quinn said, "Brother Charles, I'd like to shake your hand. You've brought sunshine back into the life of our little tot and joy to—" He emptied his glass. "Let's go over and see Nora. The booze there is just as good and costs us less." "Why don't you stay here?" she asked him. He laughed and shook his head. "Not me. Maybe you can get Nick to stay here, but I'm going with you. I've put up with your snottiness all afternoon. Now I'm going to bask in the sunshine." Gilbert Wynant was with Nora when we reached the Normandy. He kissed his sister and shook hands with me, and when he had been introduced, Harrison Quinn. Dorothy immediately began to make long and earnest and none too coherent apologies to Nora. Nora said, "Stop it, there's nothing to forgive. If Nick's told you I was sore or hurt or anything of the sort, he's just a Greek liar. Let me take your coat." Quinn turned on the radio. At the stroke of the gong, it was 5:31 1/4 Eastern Standard Time. Nora told Quinn, "Play bartender, you know where the stuff is," and followed me into the bathroom. "Where'd you find her? And I'll speak. What's Gilbert doing here?" "He came over to see her, so he said. She didn't go home last night and he thought she was still here." She laughed. "He wasn't surprised at not finding her, though. He said she was always wandering off somewhere. She has dropomania, which comes from a mother fixation and is very interesting. He said Steckel claims people who have it usually show kleptomaniac impulses too, and he's left things around to see if she'd steal them, but she never has yet that he knows of. He's quite a lad." "Did he say anything about his father?" "No. Maybe he hadn't heard. Wynant tried to commit suicide down in Allentown. Gilda and Macaulay have gone down to see him. I don't know whether to tell the youngsters or not. I wonder if Mimi had a hand in his coming over here." "I wouldn't think so, but if you do—" "I'm just wondering," I said. "Has he been here long?" "About an hour. He's a funny kid. He's been studying Chinese and writing a book on knowledge and belief, not in Chinese, and thinks Jack Oakey's very good." "So do I. Are you tight?" "Not very." When we returned to the living room, Dorothy and Quinn were dancing to "Edie Was a Lady." Gilbert put down the magazine he was looking at and politely said he hoped I was recovering from my injury. I said I was. "I've never been hurt, really hurt," he went on. "That I can remember. I've tried hurting myself, of course, but that's not the same thing. It just made me uncomfortable and irritable and I sweat a lot." "That's pretty much the same thing," I said. "Really? I thought there'd be more to it." He moved a little closer to me. "It's things like that I don't know. I'm so horribly young I haven't had a chance to— Mr. Charles, if you're too busy or don't want to, I hope you'll say so, but I'd appreciate it very much if you'd let me talk to you sometime when there aren't a lot of people around to interrupt us. There are so many things I'd like to ask you, things I don't know anybody else could tell me, and—" "I'm not so sure about that," I said, "but I'll be glad to try anytime you want." "You really don't mind? You're not just being polite?" "No, I mean it, only I'm not sure you'll get as much help as you expect. It depends on what you want to know." "Well, things like cannibalism," he said. "I don't mean in places like Africa and New Guinea and the United States, say. Is there much of it?" "Not nowadays, not that I know of." "Then there was once?" "I don't know how much, but it happened now and then before the country was completely settled. Wait a minute, I'll give you a sample." I went over to the bookcase and got the copy of Duke's Celebrated Criminal Cases of America that Nora had picked up in a second-hand bookstore, found the place I wanted, and gave it to him. It's only 3 or 4 pages. Alfred G. Packer, the man-eater who murdered his 5 companions in the mountains of Colorado, ate their bodies, and stole their money. In the fall of 1873, a party of 20 daring men left Salt Lake City, Utah to prospect in the San Juan County. Having heard glowing accounts of the fortunes to be made, they were lighthearted and full of hope as they started on their journey. But as the weeks rolled by and they beheld nothing but barren wastes and snowy mountains, they grew despondent. The further they proceeded, the less inviting appeared the country, and they finally became desperate when it appeared that their only reward would be starvation and death. Just as the prospectors were about to give up in despair, they saw an Indian camp in the distance, and while they had no assurance as to what treatment they would receive at the hands of the Reds, they decided that any death was preferable to starvation, so they agreed to take a chance. When they approached the camp, they were met by an Indian who appeared to be friendly and escorted them to Chief Ouray. To their great surprise, the Indians treated them with every consideration and insisted upon their remaining in the camp until they had fully recuperated from their hardships. Finally, the party decided to make another start with the Los Pinos Agency as their goal. Ouray attempted to dissuade them from continuing the journey and did succeed in influencing 10 of the party to abandon the trip and return to Salt Lake. The other 10 determined to continue, so Ouray supplied them with provisions and admonished them to follow the Gunnison River, which was named after Lieutenant Gunnison, who was murdered in 1852. See Life of Joe Smith the Mormon. Alfred G. Packer, who appeared as the leader of the party which continued the journey, boasted of his knowledge of the topography of the country and expressed confidence in his ability to find his way without difficulty. When his party had traveled a short distance, Packer told them that rich mines had recently been discovered near the headwaters of the Rio Grande River, and he offered to guide the party to the mines. 4 of the party insisted that they follow Ouray's instructions, but Packer persuaded 5 men named Swan, Miller, Noon, Bell, and Humphreys to accompany him to the mines, while the other 4 proceeded along the river. Of the party of 4, 2 died from starvation and exposure, but the other 2 finally reached the Los Pinos Agency in February 1874, after enduring indescribable hardships. General Adams was in command of this agency, and the unfortunate men were treated with every consideration. When they regained their strength, they started back to civilization. In March 1874, General Adams was called to Denver on business, and one cold blizzardy morning while he was still away, the employees of the agency who were seated at the breakfast table were startled by the appearance at the door of a wild-looking man who begged piteously for food and shelter. His face was frightfully bloated, but otherwise he appeared to be in fairly good condition, although his stomach would not retain the food given him. He stated that his name was Packer and claimed that his 5 companions had deserted him while he was ill, but had left a rifle with him which he brought into the agency. After partaking of the hospitality of the employees at the agency for 10 days, Packer proceeded to a place called Saquatch, claiming that he intended to work his way to Pennsylvania, where he had a brother. At Saquatch, Packer drank heavily and appeared to be well supplied with money. While intoxicated, he told many conflicting stories regarding the fate of his companions, and it was suspected that he had disposed of his erstwhile associates by foul means. At this time, General Adams stopped at Saquatch on his return from Denver to the agency, and while at the home of Otto Mears, he was advised to arrest Packer and investigate his movements. The general decided to take him back to the agency, and while en route they stopped at the cabin of Major Downey, where they met the 10 men who listened to the Indian chief and abandoned the trip. It was then proven that a great part of Packer's statement was false, so the general decided that the matter required a complete investigation, and Packer was bound and taken to the agency, where he was held in close confinement. On April 2nd, 1874, 2 wildly excited Indians ran into the agency holding strips of flesh in their hands which they called white man's meat, and which they stated they found just outside the agency. As it had been lying in the snow and the weather had been extremely cold, it was still in good condition. When Packer caught sight of the exhibits, his face became livid, and with a low moan he sank to the floor. Restoratives were administered, and after pleading for mercy, he made a statement substantially as follows: "When I and 5 others left Ouray's camp, we estimated that we had sufficient provisions for the long and arduous journey before us, but our food rapidly disappeared, and we were soon on the verge of starvation. We dug roots from the ground, upon which we subsisted for some days, but as they were not nutritious, and as the extreme cold had driven all animals and birds to shelter, the situation became desperate. Strange looks came into the eyes of each of the party, and they all became suspicious of each other. One day I went out to gather wood for the fire, and when I returned I found that Mr. Swan, the oldest man in the party, had been struck on the head and killed, and the remainder of the party were in the act of cutting up the body preparatory to eating it. His money, amounting to $2,000, was divided among the remainder of the party. This food only lasted a few days, and I suggested that Miller be the next victim because of the large amount of flesh he carried. His skull was split open with a hatchet as he was in the act of picking up a piece of wood. Humphreys and Noon were the next victims. Bell and I then entered into a solemn compact that as we were the only ones left, we would stand by each other whatever befell, and rather than harm each other, we would die of starvation. One day Bill said, 'I can stand it no longer,' and he rushed at me like a famished tiger, at the same time attempting to strike me with his gun. I parried the blow and killed him with a hatchet. I then cut his flesh into strips, which I carried with me as I pursued my journey. When I espied the agency from the top of the hill, I threw away the strips I had left, and I confess I did so reluctantly, as I had grown fond of human flesh, especially that portion around the breast." After relating this gruesome story, Packer agreed to guide a party in charge of H. Louder to the remains of the murdered men. He led them to some high inaccessible mountains, and as he claimed to be bewildered, it was decided to abandon the search and start back the next day. That night, Packer and Louder slept side by side, and during the night Packer assaulted him with the intent to commit murder and escape, but he was overpowered, bound, and after the party reached the agency, he was turned over to the sheriff. Early in June of that year, an artist named Reynolds from Peoria, Illinois, while sketching along the shores of Lake Tristoval, discovered the remains of the 5 men lying in a grove of hemlocks. 4 of the bodies were lying together in a row, and the 5th minus the head was found a short distance away. The bodies of Bell, Swan, Humphreys, and Noon had rifle bullet wounds in the back of the head, and when Miller's head was found it was crushed in, evidently by a blow from a rifle which was lying nearby, the stock being broken from the barrel. The appearance of the bodies clearly indicated that Packer had been guilty of cannibalism as well as murder. He probably spoke the truth when he stated his preference for the breast of man, as in each instance the entire breast was cut away to the ribs. A beaten path was found leading from the bodies to a nearby cabin where blankets and other articles belonging to the murdered men were discovered, and everything indicated that Packer lived in this cabin for many days after the murders, and that he made frequent trips to the bodies for the supply of human meat. After these discoveries, the sheriff procured warrants charging Packer with 5 murders, but during his absence the prisoner escaped. Nothing was heard of him again until January 29, 1883, 9 years later, when General Adams received a letter from Cheyenne, Wyoming, in which a Salt Lake prospector stated that he had met Packer face to face in that locality. The informant stated that the fugitive was known as John Schwartz and was suspected of being engaged in operations with a gang of outlaws. Detectives began an investigation, and on March 12, 1883, Sheriff Sharpless of Laramie County arrested Packer, and on the 17th, Sheriff Smith of Hinsdale County brought the prisoner back to Lake City, Colorado. His trial on the charge of murdering Israel Swan in Hinsdale County on March 1, 1874 was begun on April 3, 1883. It was proven that each member of the party except Packer possessed considerable money. The defendant repeated his former statement, wherein he claimed that he had only killed Bell and had done so in self-defense. On April 13th, the jury found the defendant guilty with the death penalty attached. A stay of execution was granted to Packer, who immediately appealed to the Supreme Court. In the meantime, he was transferred to the Gunnison jail to save him from mob violence. In October 1885, the Supreme Court granted a new trial, and it was then decided to bring him to trial on 5 charges of manslaughter. He was found guilty on each charge and was sentenced to serve 8 years for each offense, making a total of 40 years. He was pardoned on January 1, 1901, and died on a ranch in Denver on April 24, 1907. While Gilbert was reading this, I got myself a drink. Dorothy stopped dancing to join me. "Do you like him?" she asked, jerking her head to indicate Quinn. "He's all right." "Maybe, but he can be terribly silly. You never asked me where I stayed last night. Don't you care?" "It's none of my business." "But I found out something for you." "What?" "I stayed at Aunt Alice's. She's not exactly right in the head, but she's awfully sweet. She told me she had a letter from my father today warning her against Mama." "Warning her how? Just what did she say?" "I didn't see it. Aunt Alice has been mad with him for several years, and she tore it up. She says she's become a communist, and she's sure the communists killed Julia Wolf and will kill him in the end. She thinks it's all over some secret they betrayed." I said, "Oh my God." "Well, don't blame me. I'm just telling you what she told me. I told you she wasn't exactly right in the head." "Did she tell you that junk was in the letter?" Dorothy shook her head. "No, she only said the warning was. As near as I remember, she said he wrote her not to trust Mama under any circumstances and not to trust anybody connected with her, which I suppose means all of us." "Try to remember more." "But there wasn't any more. That's all she told me." "Where was the letter from?" I asked. "She didn't know, except that it had come airmail. She said she wasn't interested." "What did she think of it? I mean, did she take the warning seriously?" "She said he was a dangerous radical. They're her very words, and she wasn't interested in anything he had to say." "How seriously do you take it?" She stared at me for a long moment and then moistened her lips before she spoke. "I think Gilbert, book in hand, came over to us. He seemed disappointed in the story I had given him. It's very interesting," he said, "but if you know what I mean, it's not a pathological case." He put an arm around his sister's waist. "It was more a matter of that or starving." "Not unless you want to believe him," I said. Dorothy asked, "What is it?" "A thing in the book," Gilbert replied. "Tell him about the letter your aunt got," I said to Dorothy. She told him. When she had finished, he grimaced impatiently. "That's silly. Mama's not really dangerous. She's just a case of arrested development. Most of us have outgrown ethics and morals and so on. Mama's just not grown up into them yet." He frowned and corrected himself thoughtfully. "She might be dangerous, but it would be like a child playing with matches." Nora and Quinn were dancing. "And what do you think of your father?" I asked. Gilbert shrugged. "I haven't seen him since I was a child. I've got a theory about him, but a lot of it's guesswork. The chief thing I'd like to know is if he's impotent." I said, "He tried to kill himself today down in Allentown." Dorothy cried, "He didn't," so sharply that Quinn and Nora stopped dancing, and she turned and thrust her face up at her brothers. "Where's Chris?" she demanded. Gilbert looked from her face to mine and quickly back to hers. "Don't be an ass," he said coldly. "He's off with that girl of his, that Fenton girl." Dorothy did not look as if she believed him. "She's jealous of him," he explained to me. "It's that mother fixation." I asked, "Did either of you ever see the Sidney Kelterman your father had trouble with back when I first knew you?" Dorothy shook her head. Gilbert said, "No, why?" "Just an idea I had. I never saw him either, but the description they gave me with some easy changes couldn't be made to fit your Chris Jorgensen."